All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today. My name is Stephanie, and I will be one of your co-hosts. Today's webinar is a part of our larger BrainHQ Academy series, where we will talk about the neuroscience behind different topics. Today's topic is a very exciting one. It is the value of neurodiverse brains and how BrainHQ can help them thrive. Let's go ahead and take a look at the agenda for today. So shortly after this introduction, we're going to kick off the webinar with a poll. So in the poll, when that gets launched, you should see a little window pop up. You'll select one of the answers. It's going to be a multiple choice, and then we will reveal the poll results shortly thereafter. Following that, Dr. Mouna Attarha is going to give a presentation on the value of neurodiverse brains. Now, Dr. Attarha is a returning host to our webinar series, but for those of you who haven't seen her present before, Dr. Attarha earned her PhD in cognitive science, and she's been a senior scientist at Posit Science since 2016. She leads NIH-funded clinical trials investigating the neurochemical changes that occur by training on BrainHQ, and she also manages several trials looking at how BrainHQ exercises can improve cognitive performance. So Mouna, it's great to have you back.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah. Following that, Mouna is going to be joined in discussion with Dr. Jyoti Mishra. Dr. Mishra is also a returning guest to the webinar series. Dr. Mishra is a cognitive neuroscientist and the founder of the Neural Engineering and Translation Labs, or NEAT Labs for short, down at UC San Diego. She has expertise in studies of cognitive control and brain plasticity, integrating neuroimaging, digital health, and clinical translational approaches. So Jyoti, we're so glad that you found the time to join us again today. It's great to have you back.
Thank you. Absolutely delighted to be here again.
Following the discussion, we are going to go ahead and open up the floor to Q&A for all of you in the audience. So if at any point during the presentation today you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel, and a new window will pop up where you can type in your questions. We will do our best to answer as many as we can, but there are a lot more of you than there are of us, so we aren't going to be able to get to every question today. Now, the last thing that I wanted to note is that today's webinar is being recorded and it will get posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. So if you'd like to be notified when that video is available, you can go to youtube.com/brainhq and subscribe there in order to receive a notification when the video is posted. All right, so let's go ahead and start with that poll that I had mentioned before. So I'm going to put up a couple of images here on screen and then get this poll launched. So there are quite a few people on this screen now, and the question is, what do these people have in common? We have Steve Jobs, who is the co-founder of Apple, Simone Biles, who is a world-renowned gymnast and Olympic competitor. We have Daniel Radcliffe, who is an actor, which may look pretty familiar to most of you. After that, we have Temple Grandin, who is an author, a professor, and an animal rights activist. We also have David Bailey, who is a famous photographer. And then also we have Emma Watson, who, in addition to being an actress, is also an activist and a former UN Goodwill Ambassador. So it looks like most people have already gone ahead and jumped in the poll, but the questions or the multiple choice answers that we have available, what do these people have in common? 1, they are famous. 2, they have made significant achievements in contributions to society. 3, they are considered neurodivergent. Or 4, all of the above. So since most people are in now, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results with you all. Most of you caught on pretty quickly that what these people have in common is that they are all of the above. They are all famous, they have made significant achievements and contributions to society, and they are all also considered neurodivergent. So let's see. David Bailey, our photographer down here, has something in common with both Steve Jobs and Daniel Radcliffe. David and Steve are both have dyslexia, and then David and Daniel both have dyspraxia. Next, Simone Biles and Emma Watson, both have ADHD. And then also Temple Grandin has autism and is actually an autism activist. So there are a lot of different conditions that people can have that, have their own strengths and weaknesses. And Mouna is going to go ahead and present on that and how BrainHQ can help them.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. That was wonderful. So hi, everyone. I'm very happy that you all have joined us today to talk about how variation in brain functioning is natural and beneficial to society. It probably goes without saying that everyone here on this call is differently abled because we're all born differently, raised differently, use our brains differently. And our way of thinking results from both the machinery of the brain and the experiences that have been programmed onto it. So neurodiversity is just a fancy way of saying all brains are different. And it describes a very, very wide range of neurological functioning that naturally exists among us that impacts our mood, how we learn, how we perform tasks, how we regulate our emotions and socialize in our daily lives. So just like our fingerprints, each brain is unique and no two brains are the same. And neurodiversity is often described as a continuous spectrum. So part of that spectrum reflects people who are considered neurotypical. They have thoughts, feelings, needs, and abilities that aligned with frequent or typical ways of functioning. And then on another part of that spectrum, there are people who are neurodivergent. And these are folks with brains that display patterns of thought and behavior that differ from what's most common. They're just wired differently at birth and through their lived experience. So everyone on this call falls somewhere on this continuous spectrum of cognitive functioning. And here we have a few of the common examples of neurodivergence that affect the way people think and engage with the world. But these conditions, as you probably know, are virtually always discussed in terms of their challenges. So what you're going to hear is, oh, those with autism have difficulties with social communication, and those with attention deficit have issues with being impulsive and hyperactive, and those with dyslexia struggle to read and spell and write, and those with dyspraxia are clumsy and they have trouble with physical coordination and balance, and those with dyscalculia struggle with numbers and math. So as you can see, each of these brain states is often discussed in terms of their impairments, and that's in large part because medicine and diagnostics work by identifying problems. What's discussed less often, though, is that these brains are highly valuable and they can come with strengths that carry a competitive edge. So neurodivergent people do think differently, and many have highly specialized skill sets. And as a result of those highly specialized skill sets, their unique perspective can mean that they excel at creativity and innovation, which is a huge advantage to society. So, for example, people diagnosed with autism are more likely to have heightened pattern recognition and perceptual abilities. They have strengths related to working with systems like computer programs. And researchers have shown that they're better than those without autism at identifying tiny details and complex patterns. And then they also score significantly higher on nonverbal intelligence tests. Moving on to ADHD. These folks have an ability to hyper-focus and excel in specific areas that they're interested in or passionate about. They can think outside the box more readily and they can multitask well. And then they also display greater levels of novelty seeking and creativity than those without ADHD. People with dyslexia have a talent for creative problem solving and spatial reasoning. So they have better global visual spatial skills, including the ability to process very low definition or blurred visual scenes, and they can perceive diffused visual information more quickly and efficiently than those without dyslexia. And people with dyspraxia have been found to have stronger verbal abilities and may be more empathetic and intuitive. And those with dyscalculia may also have stronger verbal skills and problem-solving abilities. Now, different countries around the world are starting to recognize and embrace the cognitive strengths of those who are neurodivergent. So, for example, Australia's Department of Defense Australia's Department of Human Services has shown that neurodiverse teams are 30% more productive than other teams. And one of the Israeli Defense Forces special intelligence units that is responsible for analyzing aerial and satellite imaging has a group staffed with people on the autism spectrum, and they have shown that their staff can spot patterns that others do not see. And then here in the United States, some major tech companies have been aggressively recruiting folks with neurodivergent brains for occupations that involve, systematizing tasks such as writing computer manuals, managing databases, and searching for bugs in computer code. Now, it's an unfortunate reality that despite these superpowers, our world is structured in a way that does not benefit those who are neurodivergent. So as an example, Harvard Business Review featured a person named John. And John is a wizard at data analytics. He has 2 master's degrees, both with honors, but try as he might, he just can't make it through the hiring process to land a job because he seems different to those around him. He wears his headphones all the time. When people talk to him, he doesn't look right at them. He leans over every 10 minutes or so to tighten his shoelaces because he just can't concentrate when they're loose. But as soon as they're tight, he's the department's most productive employee. So this John that Harvard Business Review describes is no single person out there in the world, but instead a composite of people whose privacy they wanted to protect, but their message is very clear. There are millions of talented people out there who struggle to fit the brain profiles that are sought by others. So, for example, we expect people to read, write, do math at equally proficient skill level. We expect them to complete tasks quickly. We don't want them to be slow and take time and a half, and especially we don't want them to take double time to complete it. We expect them to be organized in the clarity of their thinking and their spoken language, as well as in the organization of their workplace and their home life. We expect them to be able to concentrate in noisy, open office spaces. We expect them to make eye contact when we're speaking to them, and we expect them not to engage in self-regulating behaviors that we find distracting, like rocking back and forth in their chair, shaking their leg up and down, flapping their arms, biting their nails, or spinning around in circles. But people do these things because that's how their brain is currently wired. So these variations in brain development come from genetics, our lived experience in early childhood and beyond, and how we're using our brains right now in our daily lives. And all of these things have organized our brain to influence how we behave and think, which means that neurodivergence has everything to do with how the brain operates chemically, structurally, and functionally. So to talk about the chemical sides first, neurotransmitters are chemicals that pass messages between nerve cells in the brain, and different quantities of these chemicals play a role in how people think and act. So at a very high level, just for illustration purposes, differences in GABA pathways may lead to differences in a person's ability to concentrate, and differences in acetylcholine may lead to differences in learning and memory, and differences in dopamine may lead to differences in motivation. So the size, so in addition to chemicals, the size of different brain areas also play a role. So for example, the size of someone's prefrontal cortex may be associated with their ability to make decisions. The size of their hippocampus may be associated with their ability to form memories, and the size of their cerebellum may be associated with their balance and coordination. And then finally, how networks in the brain function can be associated with different cognitive profiles as well. So if a network in the brain called the central executive network, which we all have, is distinctively connected, then that may lead to differences in thinking and planning. And if a network in the brain that we all have called the salience network is distinctively connected, then that may lead to differences in detecting and filtering important events that happen in our environment. So this is all to say that the chemical, structural, and functional organization of the brain determines how we think and behave. But one important thing to remember is that these things are highly plastic and they undergo continuous change daily based on what we learn and what we experience. What we know from research to date is that BrainHQ can change the brains in these same chemical, structural, and functional ways. So for example, in these initial studies, training on BrainHQ increased a learning and memory neurotransmitter in the brain called acetylcholine by 16 to 24%. Gray matter volume in the brain increased from training, and there are a couple studies showing that white matter track integrity improved. And then the functional connectivity across brain systems, such as the central executive network we mentioned earlier, also improved. And there's been shown to be greater hippocampal activation in the brain that's scaled with the person's ability to remember things in their real life. An initial study suggests this also works for neurodivergent brains as well. So a study published this year trained young adults on the autism spectrum with BrainHQ for 12 to 16 weeks. And they found significant gains in measures of cognition, such as fluency and motor functioning, as well as significant gains in clinical measures of their behavior that had to do with their inattention and hyperactivity. And this result is consistent with previous studies in ADHD, led by our guest expert here, Dr. Mishra, which have shown that brain training for 30 hours over a 6-month period led to significant improvements in the severity of their ADHD-associated behaviors and improvement in their ability to inhibit responses and suppress distraction. And the great thing is that these benefits persisted for at least 6 months after the participants stopped training. So these initial studies suggest that training may make a real impact on behavior and functioning, with benefits continuing beyond the trained period. Now, the prevalence of neurodivergent conditions has been rising at a rate that some have called an epidemic. But the question is, what factors are contributing to that rise? So we can take a step back and first look at how a diagnosis of a neurodivergent condition or brain state is made in the first place. So diagnosis is often based on a clinician's observation of the person's behavior and how well their symptoms align with the criteria in a manual that's called the DSM. And the DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And in the majority of cases, there just isn't a single blood test, there isn't a brain scan that can tell you whether or not someone has ADHD, for example. And to make things more complicated, over time, our understanding of these forms of neurodivergence has changed, and therefore so has the diagnostic criteria. So maybe we think the prevalence is increasing because of how we've categorized this brain state, and potentially because there are now fewer misdiagnoses. Or maybe we think it's increasing because there's more awareness being brought to the condition. So people who are aware are more likely to seek a diagnosis for their child, for their family members, or for their friends. And policy changes may also play a role. So in 2006, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommended screening for all children for autism during routine pediatric visits. And this may have led to diagnoses for children who would have otherwise slipped under the radar. So awareness, diagnostic criteria changes, and changes to policy probably account for the bulk of the assumed rise in prevalence, but biological and environmental factors may also be leading to a real increase in prevalence. So for example, on the biological side, there's a phenomenon called assortative mating, where folks with similar genetic or phenotypic characteristics get together, make a family. And so for illustration purposes, one parent without autism may happen to have, let's just say, 6 risk factors for it. And another parent, also without autism, may have 4 genetic risk factors. And when they reproduce, now they have a child with 10 risk factors and a much higher probability of displaying autistic traits. So some believe that may be what's happening in Silicon Valley, where highly analytical tech workers get together with other highly analytical tech workers and have a child with a high propensity for being on the spectrum. But regardless of what's causing the increase, though, the more people there are in this world who are neurodivergent, the greater the need there will be to provide help. So there are 2 general ways to tackle this issue. One way to help people fit in with society is to fix the person, right? This has been a common approach in autism, for example, where the therapy has the person hide their symptoms or compensate for their differences in settings that favor neurotypical behavior. And this may include mirroring what other people do or suppressing self-soothing behaviors like fidgeting. But, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, keeping up appearances can be pretty exhausting, and emerging evidence has linked this type of masking with increased anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So a better way to help those who are neurodivergent is actually to fix the environment so that it works better for people. And here the world would replace its very rigid one-size-fits-all approach with a more plastic approach that provides the person with tailored support, accommodations, and understanding. So for example, some folks with neurodivergent brains have sensory sensitivities. So someone sensitive to noise, for example, may need access to noise-canceling headphones or to earplugs. Someone sensitive to light may need variable lighting options rather than, overhead fluorescent lighting, which is very common in offices. Those with math, reading, and writing difficulties should have access to specialized services and academic support. Those who need to self-stimulate to focus and self-regulate may need, a moving chair, the opportunity to doodle, or the opportunity to chew gum. And those with time management challenges may need to be given more time to complete the task, plus extra reminders and some flexibility and patience from those around them. So fixing the world really does, fixing how the world is structured has the greatest chance of helping people with different brains thrive. So I think, Stephanie, we can move on to the discussion portion of the webinar.
All right, sounds good. Like I mentioned earlier, joining Mouna is going to be Dr. Jyoti Mishra. Now, Dr. Mishra, like I said, is a cognitive neuroscientist and founder of the Neural Engineering and Translation Labs, or NEAT Labs, at UCSD. Her research emphasizes scalable tech solutions that can help address important issues, including sustained psychological health and well-being. NEAT Labs research is often reported in the media. You may have seen pieces from her, including in Time Magazine, The Washington Post, NPR, The Hill, World Economic Forum, Scientific American, Neuroscience News, and even more than that. So Jyoti, very well published, very excited to have you back. Thank you again so much for joining us. Mouna and Jyoti, I will leave it to you.
Great, thank you. Jyoti, we mentioned how neurodivergence is often discussed in terms of a medical deficits-based approach rather than a strengths-based approach. What do you think are the risks of continuing to label brain states in terms of their challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there should be more awareness about neurodivergence, and I applaud you for building that in the workplace as well as in the healthcare setting. And really, like you pointed out with, say, the autism-based therapeutics, it can be harmful to try to suppress traits and try to in a way renormalize an individual to not be divergent, because really, and the strengths can help decide what kind of workplace serves best for that individual, what kind of productivity that can lead to. And in fact, I think our institutions are becoming more aware of that. I see that in the school settings where children are now allowed to choose different kinds of seating options, depending on their style. There are different learning styles that are also emphasized in the school setting. And really, like you mentioned, this is perpetuated a little bit by the shortcomings of clinical medicine, where there's not enough time to go into the broad spectrum of abilities or disabilities that an individual may have. And so individuals are characterized, unfortunately, by a specific threshold. Do you cross a threshold on a certain skill or not? But that's really not how we understand biology, which, like you showed very beautifully, it is on a spectrum, and neural responses are also fully in a distribution with no specific cutoff. So we need to do more with embracing all these differences across individuals.
I completely agree, especially for our children, right? Children are expected to just, even from a very young age, go to school, sit in their seat, not move. But a lot of them, they need that heavy motor input to stay regulated. So having teachers aware of those differences and allowing them to get that motor input, I can see being very valuable as they go through school. So taken together, around 20% of the world's population exhibits some form of neurodivergence, and that's probably an estimate where the true percentage is much higher than that. These are just people that are diagnosed. Given that these conditions are not at all rare, what do you think it means, at least what does it mean to you to have a neurotypical brain?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think people, it really actually depends on the resolution with which you measure typicality, right? So, are we talking about typicality in, say, a Harvard graduate, or in the entire population of the world, but then thinking about cultures, what is typicality in the American culture, whereas I come from an Asian culture, versus the strengths that certain native indigenous tribes may have that we cannot even think of in terms of motor skills and hunting and so on. So really the context is very important when we think about typicality of brains. And really at the crux of that is brain plasticity, in that the cultures that we grow in and the environments that we grow in, whether they are paying attention to social emotional skills, or they're really paying attention to motor skills, say in a hunter-gatherer setting, that part of the brain is developing in a stronger way, and that part of the brain is more skilled than the typical individual from another culture or social setting. So I think the context needs to be defined very well.
Yeah, because it's, neurodivergence, as you mentioned, it varies across the world, both in terms of its prevalence and acceptance. And you're also pointing out, its definition of what's typical. In some tribes, it's typical to be able to fling a spear and get a fish, but I don't think any of us here on this call would be able to do that very well. So that makes perfect sense. What about it? You mentioned your culture. How would they, what's the prevalence there and the acceptance rate? What's their understanding of neurodivergence?
I think there is more acceptance over time, even in the course of time that I have grown up as a child to an adult. There's the acceptance of neurodivergence that also clashes with the general sense of mental health stigma, and society not talking about divergence because there are differences, and where does it stem from, and we don't want to talk about deficits. And at the same time, there are cultures, like especially also in our culture, there's a lot of our mythology has divergent stories. People with extra limbs being able to do godly feats. And so where in that sense, divergence is put on a pedestal. So that's like a cultural perspective. But at the same time, I think autism, ADHD, and dyslexia, all of this is getting more attention, both in terms of diagnoses and also therapeutics. And the landscape in our connected worlds, where therapeutics can originate in the US, but also be propagated in the developing countries, because we are connected online. That advantage allows for new therapeutics in newer settings. So that's definitely the positives of the technological approaches that we're bringing.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned how some forms of neurodivergence are placed on a pedestal. You know, if neurodivergence is anything that deviates from the norm, then is giftedness also considered a form of neurodivergence?
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think giftedness is a form of neurodivergence. And at the same time, when we think about giftedness, um, we have to be careful that it's not just thinking about that individual from that unidimensional lens. So say someone's really great at math or art, and as a child, their learning is fostered within that setting, but they are leaving behind, say, other skill sets, say social emotional learning, or that's very important, like social contact and how do we engage with others very well. And that can be a challenge, especially say for people at the autistic spectrum. But there are very well, many autistic people are very good at social interaction with animals, and if not with humans. So there are ways that when we think about giftedness, the main assertion that we want to think about is to not think about it from this one-dimensional lens, to only hone that specific gifted state, because the whole health and whole brain fostering of the individual is very important for their lifelong wellness.
I completely agree. And so there's some people that are kind of born with a brain that leads, that has a great likelihood of displaying some giftedness. There are other people who kind of practice and hone in their gift. And then there's also folks who develop some form of neurodivergence or gift later on in life. They acquire it. So there have been several instances, at least in the literature, when someone who didn't have a particular skill developed one after a stroke or a brain injury. So for example, someone with no artistic ability or no musical inclination, their whole life could all of a sudden paint masterpieces or write symphonies after this brain injury. So what's likely happening to the brain of those who become acquired savants, do you think?
Yeah, so when we think about how the brain is processing information, every brain cell has what is called a receptive field, which preferentially responds to what that cell is tuned to like to respond to. So, the visual part of the brain responds to visual stimuli. And even, as you know, I don't have to tell you, but this audience obviously, can appreciate that even in the visual part of the brain, we have very specific tuning to, say, a certain line presented at a certain orientation. Now, when we imagine that, that there is so much specificity to the brain cells, part of the way that tuning develops is that the brain cells are selective to what they like, and at the same time, they are inhibiting or suppressing inputs of everything else that is not preferential to their receptive field. And so thinking about this push-pull of responding to, yes, this is what I like, versus suppressing everything else, you develop this great tuning. And now when a stroke happens and that part of the brain is damaged, then the adjacent parts of the brain and other parts of the brain can actually grow neuronal connections into that part of the brain and sort of
take over that real estate.
Exactly, take over their real estate as their own. And so, for example, in individuals who are blind, even acquired blind, the auditory parts of the brain and the touch sensitive parts of the brain take over the visual part of the brain. And given that they now have this extra real estate, you can now have hyper resolved abilities in these other modalities as well, and that can lead to acquired gifted behavior.
Yeah, and so it's really a testament where if you lose, this one area, these other regions can kind of take over. It's a testament to brain plasticity and how plastic the brain is and how it can change its, chemical, structural, functional organization. Should we open the floor to questions, Stephanie?
Yeah, we absolutely can. We have a ton of questions coming in, and I am very excited for this portion. So there have been a couple of people writing in, and if you weren't comfortable responding to these, that's also totally fine. We aren't practicing doctors. We're not allowed to give medical advice, that kind of, that whole spiel. But we had one person, Susan, write in and say, thank you for the webinar. Time blindness is a big problem for many with ADHD, and I'm wondering if there's any training that can help with this kind of issue.
I don't know of any literature off the top of my head with time training. Do you, Jyoti?
Temporal resolution is an important ability of the brain. So if you think about perceptual awareness, whether two things come together fast or too fast or slower, and whether you can discriminate two items as coming really close together or further apart in time, or actually so close together that you even don't see them as apart. That ability for time sensitivity and attention is very trainable. And I'm sure some of the exercises that BrainHQ has may have that ability to train time perception.
Recall, now that you mention it, is sort of a time-based exercise.
Yeah, and I think even parts of sweeps and others tend to present these quick succession stimuli that help to hone time perception. Now, I'm not sure if that is different from the time blindness that the individual talks about, but that's what I infer from the question. That the ability to pay attention in time can definitely be honed.
That's great to hear. And also, I guess, just to provide some context for what time blindness is, in case that is an unfamiliar term with people, my understanding of it is for many people with ADHD in particular, time blindness kind of feels like something is either happening now or not now. It's like an on-off switch rather than seeing time as like a spectrum. And so sometimes people will talk about having a time horizon where you can only see up until a certain point or only plan up until a certain point, and then everything beyond that becomes overwhelming because you can't actually sort of contextualize what's going to happen in the future. If you have other ways of summarizing that, then please feel free.
I think that's an important ability that we don't have to be neurodivergent to really appreciate. We do that on a daily basis to think about setting goals, even breaking down big goals into little goals on a short-term basis. And as any productive individual will tell you, that's a very important skill to develop. It may or may not need, computer brain exercises, but really, that a point at which overwhelm is detected, when we feel like we're overwhelmed, then we want to take a step back and say, okay, well, how can this planning be broken down into very short sub goals and try to get at those one at a time? And this is something we just have to repeatedly practice.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so Harold has an interesting question. He says, I feel today that many people accept or look for a diagnosis and then use that as an excuse for behavior rather than accepting their diagnosis and then looking for ways to excel based on the positives of their condition. Am I being too critical? What are y'all's takes on that?
Well, I think let me rephrase that. You're asking that if one has a neurodivergent ability, then that's taken as an excuse for something that is done not in convention, or even when people are making mistakes, and not to just always put that out as an excuse. Is that something we're talking about here?
Yeah, so not to speak on behalf of Harold, but sort of the example that comes to mind is people who struggle with executive dysfunction, or like the starting of tasks being perceived as being lazy because they aren't doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing, like that kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think workplaces need to be more open to neurodivergence, which is really the core of the seminar in workplaces and living places. And I think one can really tell that if you have an open and inclusive environment, that a neurodivergent individual is able to convey confidentially their needs and their abilities and disabilities. And in that sense, people that are working with them are able to actually see when it is being used as an advantage, as something that they're also as a ways that they're trying to get better at things, or they're just using it as an excuse for anything that wrong that happens. So the latter is obviously not good, but any work setting can detect how motivated an individual is despite their neurodivergence. So yeah, I think it's, we can't be too critical. We can't put everyone in the same bucket, but I've worked with, in the workplace setting, work with a lot of neurodivergent individuals, and I can definitely tell when people are putting in the effort despite their disabilities, and trying to overcome challenges, and that's very much appreciated.
I see these questions about genetics versus environment. Are you seeing a few of those too, Stephanie?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple of questions about specifically if sorry, this is just sort of blank there, was reading through and got distracted by another wonderful question. Sort of people who maybe develop these conditions later in life, or maybe they started out with a condition and then some people seem to minimize their symptoms into adulthood, versus people who maybe have a hereditary link. Can you guys talk about some of those?
Yeah, so I think like everything else, nature and nurture go hand in hand. Neurodivergence is at least partly influenced by genetics, and this comes mainly from studies showing that it runs in families. So some researchers have argued that certain groups of conditions have a common etiology. So for example, ADHD, dyslexia, and dyspraxia may run in families together because they're caused by differences in phospholipid metabolism in the brain. That said, your environment may modulate how severe the condition can be. So in many cases, targeted intervention helps, especially when that intervention is applied intensively. But on the other hand, as we mentioned, there are times where neurodivergence is acquired later in life as you age, such as adult onset ADHD or adult onset dyspraxia. But it's more common, and there are, true pure forms of that condition, but it's more often the case that these adult onset versions are due to something else. Maybe substance use, maybe a brain injury, maybe a stroke, maybe a psychiatric conditions that's kind of giving rise to those symptoms or those brain states.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And so in healthcare, when we think about nature versus nurture, that balance can be struck by having a trauma-informed care setting. And what that means is that, in my own research, we've learned and done research on showing how kids who've grown up in deprived environments and who've been neglected and or even suffered abuse in those environments, those children tend to have adolescent ADHD symptoms, and these can be very much mistaken many times as biological neurodevelopmental ADHD that may be genetically driven. And so having good assessments of where an individual's different symptoms are coming from, whether it's environmentally related and therefore can be changed, or whether they are truly genetically driven and therefore, therapies when started early could prove as effective interventions. That's really important. So a setting that takes into account this context of the trauma that an individual has had is important for sure.
Yeah, and also different brain states probably have different have a different amount of, how much the genetics influences it. So for example, autism, I've read reports in JAMA, which is a journal of the American Medical Association, that have shown that, 80% of autism risk can be traced to inherited genes rather than environmental factors and random mutations. So probably whether it's autism or ADHD, the contribution of the underlying genetics probably varies across conditions.
Right, awesome. So I am also seeing a lot of questions about using BrainHQ in child populations and whether BrainHQ would be helpful for a child with autism or ADHD or any of these other conditions that we've talked about so far. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so we have a few of those studies using BrainHQ and autism and ADHD. These are not run by, internal researchers. It's most likely there are a number of researchers external to the company who they have their own grant funding and then come to us and they want to use our program in the population that they're interested in, and then they put out their paper. We see it online and then we add it to our website. So we're just kind of beholden to the conditions that external researchers prefer to study. But there has been some, at least initial studies in those populations. And in terms, I think BrainHQ has been used in children as young as 5 years old in Australia. And they were using it in a number of elementary schools in Australia. And yeah, I mean, I think they had a little bit more difficulty being able to initially understand the task. But I think that once the teachers kind of sat with them and walked them through it and had multiple practice sessions, once they really understood what was required of them, they were able to engage with it. I have actually done BrainHQ with my 4-year-old, where I'll pull up my computer and then, I'll present the stimuli for her and she'll just tell me what the response is and I'll enter it myself. So she's actually enjoyed it. But I think they just need some additional support at the very beginning to understand the task, because BrainHQ is initially, designed for adults. But then once they understand it, they'll be able to engage with it. And what's nice about each of the exercises and the levels within those exercises is they will adapt to your own individual performance abilities. So all of those speeded tasks where the amount of time the stimuli are on the screen gets shorter and shorter as you get the answers correct, they also will become longer and longer as you get the answers wrong. And that's so that we can meet you wherever your brain is currently, and then we can push you forward. So that sort of personalized experience, I think, is going to help some of the younger users here.
All right, fantastic. 4 years old using BrainHQ. I think that's a new record.
I mean, she's not doing actual session, but she'll sit next to me and she'll, she asks what I'm doing, and then she likes to play a few trials and just tell me what she thinks her answer is. It's really cute.
That's really, really cute. All right. So Mark has an interesting question. Are there particular BrainHQ exercises that are tailored to specific neurodivergent conditions, either to alleviate deficits or develop strengths? That's a really good question.
Yeah, I think one thing we should know is that, you know, one person's brain with ADHD is not the exact same as another person's brain with ADHD. So we kind of need to know, you know, what their cognitive profile is. What's nice about our default personal trainer is that, you know, it ultimately walks the user across all 29 exercises and then adapts the exercises that are presented based on the person's individual performance abilities. So if they struggle on, let's say, the visual exercises, but they're really extra good on the auditory exercises, then it's going to present more instances or more opportunities for growth for visual, and it's going to present the auditory exercises at a lower frequency. So kind of using the default personal trainer that we have when you log in, I think is a good way to see what someone's strengths and what their opportunities for growth are.
All right, awesome. Here is, so I know we've been getting a lot of questions about children, but we had somebody write in about presumably adults in the workplace. Are employers required by law to provide reasonable adjustments for neurodivergent people in the workplace, or is it not a legal requirement? Do you have any information about that?
I don't know I don't know if there are any laws around that. I know that a number of major US-based companies like Google, for example, Salesforce, they're starting to make those accommodations, but I'm not sure about from a legal standpoint. Jyoti, do you happen to know?
It's not there specifically from a legal standpoint, but definitely in a lot of companies, there is a mandate for supporting inclusivity as part of their DEI goals. And these are not just fuzzy goals. These are something that the company's executive, there are certain benchmarks that have to be met regarding that, which may include inclusion of a certain percentage of neurodivergent individuals in the company. And so I think every company is making their own rules about it, but there's definitely headway in this direction at the individual company level. And I think it's, if you're interested in any specific company, you can if it's a publicly traded company, you can look up what their mandates are, and you know, see if their mission aligns with an inclusive workplace for neurodivergent individuals.
Yeah, what I will also say, as a neurodivergent person who has asked for accommodations at work, there are some conditions that are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, where accommodations are actually going to be required, or not required, but if you ask for them and they are reasonable accommodations, your employer should be able to fulfill them. One of the resources that I used in particular is called JAN. It's the Job Accommodation Network. You can find more about them at askjan.org, but basically it has a search function where you type in your condition or disability, and then it tells you different kinds of accommodations or tools that may be reasonable to ask your employer for at work. So that was a big help for me, and I also definitely recommend it to everybody else. All
like
right.
this question about hearing loss. Can wearing hearing aids earlier prevent or delay dementia? So hearing loss is one of the number one modifiable risk factors for for dementia risk later on, and it's called modifiable because you can do something about it. Right now, the literature is all observational. People who happen to have hearing loss are shown to have a greater likelihood to progress onto dementia. And the reason why is we can't run randomized clinical trials ethically, right? We can't get a bunch of people to come in and we can't induce hearing loss for them and then follow them to see, you know, which people convert to dementia and if it's more likely than if their hearing is intact. But our current understanding is that wearing hearing aids is really important if you can't hear. Getting cataract surgery is really important if you can't see. It's really good for your brain so that you're not missing out on that stimulation, and you can minimize the risk for developing later dementia by having those hearing aids.
Yeah, that's something that I hadn't really considered before, was that connection. And so that was a great point to break up, or a great point to bring up, excuse me. Um, all right. We had somebody ask about, this is an interesting one. And if you're not comfortable answering this, of course, feel free to, shove it away. But somebody was asking if you could talk about the role of nutrition in contributing to these various conditions. Can altering your diet help to address various symptoms? Are there specific minerals or uh, things that you can put into your diet that may help with various symptoms from these various conditions?
I'm not a nutritionist, but I believe number one diet that has been used in a randomized controlled trial, and that's, we want to identify causation and not correlation. That's why I'm talking about randomized controlled trials. That has shown benefit on a cognitive outcome at the end of the trial. It has been what's called the MIND diet, and it combines the Mediterranean diet, lots of fatty fish like salmon, dark leafy green vegetables, berries, nuts, combining that with the hypertensive diet, which, low salt, low sodium. And so if you look up the MIND diet, and I believe maybe the Mayo Clinic, they have a guideline, or Healthline, a guideline of, what the servings of dark leafy green vegetables are per week, berries per week, nuts and seeds per week, fish, and so on. So in these diets, you generally want to minimize all the fun foods, right? Foods, pastries, fried foods, candy, things with a lot of sugar, things with a lot of salt, processed oils, and so on. So yeah, it's not fun to hear, but I think the MIND diet has the most evidence of all the different diets out there. I also know that in the context of epilepsy, so children who are experiencing seizures, going on a keto diet or low carbohydrate, high fat being not from butter and red meat, but the fat being from olive oil and avocados, and nuts, of course, have been beneficial to reduce the number of seizures.
Yeah, there's also been a lot of trials related to, say, the Mediterranean diet that is very much a part of the MIND diet in terms of improving well-being and depression and anxiety outcomes that can be very much related to neurodivergence. And the main crux is like really thinking about what you're putting in your body. Is it ultra processed and processed in certain ways? The simpler foods that you can have, the better it is for your body and for your mind in this case. So yeah, like Mouna said, definitely check out the MIND diet, and incorporating healthy fats and protein and whole grain cereals is very important for brain health.
All right. So I think we have time for one more very, very brief question. I know we're kind of squeezed for time, but we have a lot of people that have written in, and they are curious about how to go and start the process of maybe getting a diagnosis if they think that they maybe have one of these conditions, or maybe they have a child or a loved one with one of these conditions. Can either of you speak to sort of that whole process?
I think it all starts from primary care, being able to discuss your concerns and then being referred to a specialist, whether it's a psychiatrist or a neuropsychologist, and so they can do the exact evaluations. But a formal evaluation is definitely what would be required in this case, as opposed to really looking at online questionnaires that are not validated by your clinician.
All right. So I think let's go ahead and wrap it up here, since it is 2 o'clock. We ran a little bit over. Thank you both so much for staying a little bit longer here. I'm going to go ahead and put up Jyoti's information on the screen here. Like we mentioned earlier, she is the founder and director of NEAT Labs at UCSD. You can find her socials there. And she also very recently published a book called The Little Brain. Jyoti, can you give us like a little brief primer on what The Little Brain is about?
Sure. Thank you for talking about it. It's a book about learning and how kids can have more effective learning as they're growing up, and yeah, some of the vital elements of brain plasticity that we talked about today are weaved into a child's story, so it makes it easy to convey it to the child.
That's so exciting. It's so Mouna and I were talking about this earlier, but it's so great to like have books that talk about, exploring that novelty and sort of that scientific theory and working through it as a child. So very exciting. All right. So I think that's gonna wrap it up here. I wanted to take a moment here to thank all of you in the audience for participating and asking so many wonderful questions. Again, I'm sorry that we didn't have an opportunity to answer all of them today. If you are interested in our next webinar, we have one coming up next month called BrainHQ for All. Learn about BrainHQ's unique accessibility features available to you. So this will be taking place on November 15th. So we'll send out an email to that email invite, to that webinar a week before the webinar starts. So keep an eye out for that. Jyoti, once again, thank you so much for guesting with us. It's always a pleasure having you. And then Mouna, thank you again so much for your presentation. Do either of you have any final words that you'd like to share with the audience today?
Yeah, I just hope that what we've all learned is that neurodiversity is a natural and valuable aspect of human diversity that should be celebrated.
Absolutely.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all again so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And the recording of this webinar will get posted to our YouTube channel sometime next week. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.